Right now, in a museum in Argentina, there's a 13-year-old girl sitting inside a glass box at -20 degrees Celsius. She's been sitting for 500 years, dead but not mummified, because she froze at the mountain peak, alive. Her skin is still soft, her hair is still shiny, her fingerprints are still visible. And when scientists tested her blood, they were shocked. There was so much coca in her system that they said, this child was constantly drugged for the last 6 months. Why? Because Inca priests were preparing her for death. Systematically, a little more drugs every day, so her body would adapt, because at the summit they would give her such a dose that she wouldn't resist. She wouldn't want her family. She would just sleep and never wake up again. Today tourists come and take photos. So well preserved, they say, but nobody asks, what did this child feel? Was she conscious? Did she suffer? The Inca Empire called this a sacred ritual. What do we call it? Before diving into one of archaeology's most disturbing discoveries and what it reveals about how civilizations sacrifice children in the name of religion, if you enjoy learning about the uncomfortable truths history tries to hide, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these difficult truths together, connected by our refusal to look away from what makes us uncomfortable. Let's start with what we know for certain, because the scientific evidence is overwhelming and impossible to deny. On March 16, 1999, archaeologist Johann Reinhard and his team reached the summit of Huayllaca, a volcano on the border between Argentina and Chile, at 6,739 meters, 22,109 feet. It's one of the highest archaeological sites in the world. The thin air makes every movement exhausting. The temperature hovers around -20 degrees Celsius, -4 degrees Fahrenheit. But Reinhard knew something was there. Satellite imagery and local legends both pointed to an Inca ceremonial site at the peak. What they found changed our understanding of Inca religion forever. Not one body, but three children, preserved so perfectly by the freezing temperatures that for a moment the archaeologists thought they might still be alive. But these children had been dead for approximately 500 years, placed there sometime between 1440 and 1480 CE during the height of the Inca Empire. The oldest was a teenage girl, approximately 13 to 15 years old when she died. She became known as La Doncella, or the Maiden in Spanish, Huayllaca Maiden in English. She was sitting in a cross-legged position, head bowed forward, hands resting on her knees, as if she had simply fallen asleep. Her face was serene. Her skin, though darkened by time and altitude, was intact. Her internal organs were perfectly preserved. Even her fingerprints were still visible. She was dressed in elaborate clothing that would have been impossibly expensive in Inca society. Her outer garment was made from fine alpaca wool, woven with intricate patterns in red and gold. She wore a feathered headdress, the kind reserved for nobility or those of special status. Silver and gold pins held her clothing in place. Around her were ceramic vessels containing chicha, corned beer, coca leaves, and small figurines made of gold, silver, and spondylus shell, a rare and precious material in Inca culture. Next to her were 2 younger children, a boy approximately 7 years old and a girl about 6. They too were dressed in fine clothing and surrounded by ritual objects. All 3 had been deliberately placed in small stone structures at the summit, seated in positions that suggested they had been alive when positioned. The structures were then sealed with stones and earth. The preservation was so perfect that scientists could perform analyses that are normally impossible on ancient remains. And what they discovered was both fascinating and horrifying. Let's start with the hair analysis, because it tells us the most complete story of what these children experienced in their final year. Human hair grows at a predictable rate, approximately 1 centimeter per month. By analyzing different sections of hair from root to tip, scientists can create a timeline of what a person consumed months or even years before death. The Huayllaca Maiden's hair was long enough to provide about 2 years of data. The analysis revealed dramatic changes in the last year of her life. For the first year recorded in her hair, her diet was typical of a commoner: potatoes, quinoa, vegetables with occasional meat. But approximately 12 months before her death, everything changed. Her diet shifted dramatically to include much more meat, particularly llama and alpaca, and large quantities of maize, corn, which in Inca society was a luxury food used to make chicha and primarily consumed by elites. Even more revealing was the coca analysis. Coca leaves, from which cocaine is derived, were sacred and restricted in Inca society. Common people weren't allowed to use them. Only nobility, priests, and those involved in religious ceremonies had regular access. The maiden's hair showed that she had consumed little to no coca for most of her life, but starting about 12 months before death, coca consumption began and steadily increased. In her final weeks, the concentration of coca metabolites in her hair was extraordinarily high, suggesting she was consuming coca constantly. Blood analysis confirmed this. The concentration of cocaine and coca-ethylene, a metabolite that forms when coca is consumed with alcohol, in her system was so high that the researchers stated she would have been heavily sedated, possibly unconscious, when she died. She wasn't just given coca, she was systematically drugged to the point of losing consciousness. This wasn't an accident or a mercy. This was a carefully planned, year-long process of preparation for ritual sacrifice. Let me explain what we believe happened, based on the physical evidence, Spanish colonial accounts of Inca practices, and the archaeological context. The girl who would become the Yuyaca maiden was probably selected around age 12 or 13. The selection process for Capacocha, as the Incas called this practice, was specific. Only children who were physically perfect could be chosen. No scars, no deformities, no blemishes. Beauty was important, but perfection was essential. The child also usually came from a noble or at least well-connected family. This wasn't random selection from among the peasantry. Being chosen was supposed to be an honor, the highest honor an Inca family could receive. When a child was selected, they were taken from their home region, in the maiden's case, probably somewhere in what is now northern Argentina or Chile, and brought to Cusco, the capital of the Inca Empire. This journey could take months. Along the way, villages would celebrate the chosen child, making offerings and performing rituals. The child was no longer considered fully human. They were becoming something sacred, a bridge between the human and divine worlds. In Cusco, the child would live in or near the imperial palace complex for up to a year. This is when the dietary changes began. They were fed the best foods, dressed in the finest clothes, and treated with the deference normally reserved for royalty. In Inca belief, they were becoming divine. They were being prepared to join the mountain gods, the Apis, who controlled weather, water, and the fertility of the land. But this honor came with a price that was hidden from the child, or perhaps that the child was trained to accept. During this year of preparation, the child was increasingly given coca. Initially, perhaps just chewing leaves, a practice that produces a mild stimulant effect similar to strong coffee. But gradually, the doses increased. Coca was mixed into chicha, creating a more potent effect as alcohol enhances coca's absorption. By the end of the preparation period, the child was likely coca-dependent and heavily intoxicated most of the time. Why? The official reason would have been religious, to help the child commune with the divine, to ease their transition from human to sacred status. But the practical reason is darker. A drugged child is a compliant child. A child who is heavily sedated won't resist when taken to a remote mountaintop, won't scream, won't fight, won't run. The coca made the ritual possible by making the victim manageable. After the preparation period in Cusco, the final journey began. The child, along with priests and attendants, would travel to the chosen mountain. Yuyaca is extraordinarily remote and difficult to reach even today with modern equipment. In 1450, it would have required a journey of several weeks from Cusco, traveling over 1,600 kilometers through some of the most challenging terrain in South America. Along the route, the procession would stop at villages and ceremonial sites. At each stop, there would be rituals, offerings, and celebrations. The child was the center of attention, treated as sacred, worship even. For a young person, especially one kept in a constant drug-induced haze, this must have been surreal. Were they happy, terrified? Both. The drugs make it impossible to know what they truly felt. The final ascent of Yuyaca would have taken days. At nearly 7,000 meters, the altitude makes every step exhausting. The air contains less than half the oxygen available at sea level. Without acclimatization, altitude sickness would cause severe headaches, nausea, and confusion. But the Inca were master high-altitude peoples, and the priests accompanying the child would have been experienced in such climbs. At the summit, a small stone structure had been built probably years or even decades earlier specifically for this purpose. Archaeological evidence shows that the summit of Yuyaca was used for multiple Capacocha ceremonies over time. Inside the structure, barely large enough for a person to sit, the child was positioned, cross-legged, head bowed, hands resting on knees. The ritual objects were placed around them: ceramic vessels containing chicha, coca leaves for the afterlife, small figurines representing llamas and humans, perhaps substitutes for additional sacrifices, and textiles, everything they might need in the divine realm. Then, and this is where the evidence becomes most disturbing, the child was given a final, massive dose of coca and alcohol. The concentration of drugs in the maiden's system suggests she received enough to render her unconscious or at least severely impaired. She may not have been aware of what was happening in those final moments. The structure was then sealed. Stones were placed over the opening. Earth was piled on top, and the priests descended, leaving the child alone at the summit in the freezing darkness, with temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Celsius or lower at night. Death would have come from a combination of factors: hypothermia, hypoxia, lack of oxygen, and possibly the drug overdose itself. How long did it take? Hours? Days? We can't know for certain, but we do know this. The child froze before decomposition could begin. The extreme cold and altitude created perfect preservation conditions. The body effectively freeze-dried, with ice crystals forming in the tissues so quickly that cellular structure remained intact. This is why, 500 years later, scientists could still analyze blood, organs, and even DNA. Now let's address the obvious question. Why? Why would the Inca do this? What possible justification exists for systematically drugging and freezing children to death on remote mountaintops? The Inca explanation is recorded in Spanish colonial sources, written by chroniclers who arrived after the conquest and interviewed Inca informants about pre-conquest practices. According to these sources, Capacocha was the highest form of offering to the gods. The Inca believed that mountain peaks were sacred, dwelling places of the Apis, powerful deities who controlled essential resources like water, weather, and crop fertility. These gods demanded offerings, and the most valuable offering was human life, specifically perfect human life. Children were ideal because they were innocent, unblemished by adult sins. The most perfect children, those with no physical flaws, from good families, beautiful and healthy, were the most pleasing to the gods. By offering such a child, the Inca believed they were ensuring divine favor, good harvests, victory in war, protection from natural disasters, and general prosperity for the empire. Capacocha was not random or frequent. It was performed on special occasions: the death of an emperor, the accession of a new emperor, major military victories, or in response to natural disasters like earthquakes or droughts. Each ceremony involved enormous expense and effort. The year of preparation, the elaborate clothing and ritual objects, the journey to remote peaks. All of this required resources that only the imperial government could mobilize. This was also, let's be clear, a demonstration of imperial power. The Inca Empire controlled a vast territory, from modern Ecuador to central Chile, an area comparable in size to the continental United States. Maintaining this empire required not just military force but also ideological control. By demanding that subject peoples provide children for Capacocha, the Inca were demonstrating total authority. They could take your most precious possession, your child, and you not only had to give them up, you had to consider it an honor. The families who gave up children were rewarded. They received land grants, were exempted from labor obligations, and gained prestige within their communities. The child's sacrifice elevated the entire family's status. This created a system where families might actually volunteer their children, or at least accept the selection without resistance, because refusal would mean losing all these benefits and marking the family as impious and disloyal. But here's what the official narrative hides. The children almost certainly didn't want to die. Regardless of religious indoctrination, regardless of how honored they were told they should feel, the physical evidence suggests the Inca knew the children would resist if given the chance. That's why the drugs were necessary. That's why the doses increased over time. That's why the final dose was large enough to render them unconscious. A willing sacrifice doesn't need to be drugged into unconsciousness. The massive doses of coca and alcohol weren't religious sacraments. They were chemical restraints. They were a way to ensure compliance in victims who, given a choice, would have chosen life. Think about the Uyaka maiden in her final conscious moments. She's 13 years old, sitting in a stone chamber barely larger than a closet, at an altitude where every breath is a struggle, in cold so intense it hurts to exist. She's been told for a year that this is an honor, that she's becoming divine, that she'll protect her people forever. But she's also been increasingly drugged, her judgment and will systematically eroded by substances she had no choice about consuming. Does she believe the religious narrative? Maybe, probably at least partially. The Inca were masterful at indoctrination, and a year of constant reinforcement from priests and nobles, all presented as absolute truth, would be hard for anyone to resist, let alone a teenager. But does belief make it consensual? Can a child consent to their own death, especially when they've been systematically drugged and cut off from family and any alternative perspective? The answer, from any modern ethical standpoint, is no. This was murder, ritually sanctified, religiously motivated, culturally normalized murder, but murder nonetheless. The victim's inability to resist due to indoctrination and drugs doesn't make it less evil. If anything, it makes it worse, because it shows premeditation and systematic breaking of the victim's will. Now let's talk about what happened after. For 500 years, the children sat in their stone chambers, frozen in time. The Inca Empire collapsed in the 1530s, conquered by Spanish invaders who brought disease, weapons, and their own religious justifications for violence. The locations of most Capacocha sites were forgotten. The children remained undisturbed on their remote peaks. Then, in the 20th century, as archaeology became more sophisticated and as mountaineers pushed into higher altitudes, the sites began to be discovered. Uyaka was far from the first. Since the 1950s, dozens of Capacocha sites sites have been found throughout the Andes, from Peru to Argentina to Chile. Each one contains similar evidence: child remains, elaborate clothing, ritual objects, and the unmistakable signs of ceremony. The discovery of the Yuyaca children in 1999 was particularly significant because of the exceptional preservation. Most Capacocha remains are partially decomposed or damaged by exposure, but these 3 children were nearly perfect, allowing for unprecedented scientific analysis. They provided the clearest picture yet of what Capacocha actually entailed. The answer from any modern ethical standpoint is no. This was murder, ritually sanctified, religiously motivated, culturally normalized murder, but murder nonetheless. The victim's inability to resist due to indoctrination and drugs doesn't make it less evil. If anything, it makes it worse, because it shows premeditation and systematic breaking of the victim's will. Now let's talk about what happened after. For 500 years, the children sat in their stone chambers, frozen in time. The Inca Empire collapsed in the 1530s, conquered by Spanish invaders who brought disease, weapons, and their own religious justifications for violence. The locations of most Capacocha sites were forgotten. The children remained undisturbed on their remote peaks. Then, in the 20th century, as archaeology became more sophisticated and as mountaineers pushed into higher altitudes, the sites began to be discovered. Yuyaca was far from the first. Since the 1950s, dozens of Capacocha sites have been found throughout the Andes, from Peru to Argentina to Chile. Each one contains similar evidence: child remains, elaborate clothing, ritual objects, and the unmistakable signs of ceremony. The discovery of the Yuyaca children in 1999 was particularly significant because of the exceptional preservation. Most Capacocha remains are partially decomposed or damaged by exposure, but these 3 children were nearly perfect, allowing for unprecedented scientific analysis. They provided the clearest picture yet of what Capacocha actually entailed. The museum has tried to balance these concerns. The displays emphasize respect and cultural context. Children under age 6 aren't allowed to view the mummies. Photography is forbidden. The atmosphere is deliberately somber and reverential. The intent is to honor the children as sacred, as they were treated in life, while also acknowledging the educational and scientific value of the remains. But these efforts can't resolve the fundamental tension. Is it ethical to display dead children, even in the name of education and cultural preservation? The children couldn't consent to being displayed. They were sacrificed against what was almost certainly their will if they'd been given a real choice. Now, centuries later, they're still being used, not as offerings to gods, but as objects of scientific inquiry and tourist attraction. The museum's visitor book contains comments that illustrate this tension. Some visitors write about how moved they were, how the display helped them understand and respect Inca culture. Others express discomfort or outright horror that children's bodies are on display. Still others focus on the scientific marvel of preservation, treating the children as specimens rather than persons. What's often lost in these debates about display ethics is attention to the children as individuals. The Yuyaca maiden wasn't a Capacocha sacrifice, or an Inca mummy, or an archaeological specimen. She was a person. She had thoughts, feelings, preferences, fears. She experienced a year of increasing drug use that clouded her judgment. She experienced the final journey to the mountain peak. She experienced, however briefly or hazily, the realization that she was being left to die. The museum has tried to balance these concerns. The displays emphasize respect and cultural context. Children under age 6 aren't allowed to view the mummies. Photography is forbidden. The atmosphere is deliberately somber and reverential. The intent is to honor the children as sacred, as they were treated in life, while also acknowledging the educational and scientific value of the remains. But these efforts can't resolve the fundamental tension. Is it ethical to display dead children, even in the name of education and cultural preservation? The children couldn't consent to being displayed. They were sacrificed against what was almost certainly their will if they'd been given a real choice. Now, centuries later, they're still being used, not as offerings to gods, but as objects of scientific inquiry and tourist attraction. The museum's visitor book contains comments that illustrate this tension. Some visitors write about how moved they were, how the display helped them understand and respect Inca culture. Others express discomfort or outright horror that children's bodies are on display. Still others focus on the scientific marvel of preservation, treating the children as specimens rather than persons. What's often lost in these debates about display ethics is attention to the children as individuals. The Yuyaca maiden wasn't a Capacocha sacrifice, or an Inca mummy, or an archaeological specimen. She was a person. She had thoughts, feelings, preferences, fears. She experienced a year of increasing drug use that clouded her judgment. She experienced the final journey to the mountain peak. She experienced, however briefly or hazily, the realization that she was being left to die. Scientific analysis can tell us what she ate, what drugs were in her system, what diseases she may have had, how she died. But it can't tell us what she thought about any of it. Did she genuinely believe she was becoming divine? Was she terrified but unable to express it? Did the drugs make her compliant but internally screaming? Was there a moment of clarity where she understood what was happening and wished desperately to escape? We'll never know. The person inside the preserved body is gone, her subjectivity lost forever. All we have is the physical shell and the cultural context that sent her to that mountaintop. This brings us to the bigger questions that the Uyaka children force us to confront. How should we judge the Inca for Capacocha? They were operating within a completely different cultural and religious framework. They genuinely believed they were honoring these children, elevating them to divine status, ensuring the prosperity of their civilization. The priests who administered ever-increasing doses of coca probably told themselves they were being merciful, easing the child's transition. The families who gave up children probably truly believed it was the greatest honor their family could receive. But cultural relativism has limits. We can understand why the Inca practiced Capacocha without excusing it. We can acknowledge that their religious beliefs were genuine without accepting that genuine belief justifies killing children. Belief doesn't make murder less evil, it just makes it more complicated. We tell ourselves these are different, these aren't religious sacrifices, we're not deliberately killing children for ritual purposes. And technically, that's true, but the pattern is similar. Some children's lives and well-being are considered acceptable losses in service of maintaining systems that benefit adults and those in power. We just don't call it sacrifice anymore. We call it unfortunate necessity, or collateral damage, or market forces, or political reality. The Inca at least believed their child sacrifices ensured divine favor and community prosperity. What do we believe our sacrifices accomplish? Are our justifications any more valid? That's not a rhetorical question. It's something we need to seriously examine. The Uyaka children can't speak for themselves, but their preserved bodies speak to us across 5 centuries, asking uncomfortable questions about what we're willing to do to children, our own or others, in service of systems we've convinced ourselves are necessary or beneficial or divinely ordained. The museum in Salta remains open. The children remain in their climate-controlled chambers, rotated through display every 6 months. Tourists continue to visit, taking no photographs but carrying away memories of seeing a 500-year-old child who looks like she might wake up at any moment. But she won't wake up. She died alone on a freezing mountaintop, far from everyone she loved, drugged into unconsciousness so she wouldn't resist her own murder. That's the truth beneath the cultural relativism and the scientific fascination and the museum's respectful displays. The Inca Empire is gone, destroyed by conquest and disease and the relentless advance of different civilizations with different ways of sanctifying violence. But the pattern Capacocha exemplifies, the sacrifice of the vulnerable in service of the powerful, justified through religious or ideological narratives that make the unbearable seem necessary, that pattern persists. Remember the girl in the glass box. Remember that she was drugged systematically for a year. Remember that she was 13 years old. Remember that calling it sacred doesn't make it less evil. Remember that every civilization, including ours, finds ways to normalize the unthinkable. And ask yourself, what are we doing today that future generations will look at with the same horror we feel looking at that preserved child, that future people will struggle to understand how we could possibly justify? The answer, whatever it is, should make us as uncomfortable as that girl in the glass box makes us now. Because discomfort is appropriate. Discomfort is the correct response to systematic harm dressed up as honor or necessity or sacred duty. The Uyaka maiden has been dead for 500 years. Her suffering is over, but the questions her death raises are as alive and urgent today as they were the day she was carried to that mountaintop and left to freeze. Those questions won't leave us alone. They shouldn't. That's what the dead children are for, to remind the living of what we're capable of when we convince ourselves that some lives matter less than our systems, our beliefs, our convenience, our gods.